November 1838. Moundsville, Virginia. Abelard Tomlinson was not an archaeologist. He was a landowner, and the 69-foot mound that rose from his property was simply a feature of the land he had inherited, something his family had lived beside for years without particularly questioning. That changed in November of 1838, when Tomlinson and his sons put shovels into the mound's summit and began cutting a vertical shaft straight down through its center. They were not looking for history. They were looking for whatever was inside. What they found, deep in the earth, was a chamber that had been sealed for over 1,000 years, 2 burial vaults lined with logs that had long since compressed into dark stains in the soil, human remains, objects placed deliberately alongside the dead, grave goods arranged with a care that implied ritual, intention, belief, and at the bottom of the shaft, small enough to fit in a man's palm, a sandstone disc covered in symbols that none of the Tomlinsons, none of their neighbours, and none of the scholars who would spend the next century and a half arguing over it could definitively read. The shaft was still open. The stone was still warm from handling. And something that had been sealed and silent since before the Norman conquest had just been pulled into the November air of the American frontier. This investigation does not begin with a theory. It begins with that stone. What follows from it, the arguments, the surveys, the institutions, the continental patterns, and the records that do not add up, runs the length of a continent and the better part of 2 centuries, if you want to follow where each thread leads, staying through matters. Because what was found inside Grave Creek Mound was not the end of a mystery. It was the first thread of one that had been buried far longer than anyone in 1838 understood. The mound that Abelard Tomlinson cut open was not ordinary terrain. It was the largest conical burial mound in the region, 69 feet high, nearly 300 feet in diameter at its base, and it had been built by people whose identity, by 1838, had been entirely swallowed by time. The construction alone was staggering to consider. Hundreds of thousands of cubic feet of earth, carried in baskets and placed in deliberate layers over what archaeological evidence would later suggest was a period of sustained, organized effort. Not thrown up in a season, engineered across time. The shaft Tomlinson dug reached its first vault approximately 10 feet above the base of the mound. Log-lined walls, a burial, then continuing downward a second vault closer to the base, older, deeper, placed there first, the structural foundation of everything built above it. The remains inside both chambers showed evidence of deliberate interment. These were not bodies dropped into a hole. They were placed, accompanied, and sealed, and among the objects sealed with them was the stone, small, roughly oval, sandstone, covered on one face with engraved lines arranged in what appeared, to everyone who examined it, to be a deliberate inscription, not random marks, not natural weathering patterns. Symbols laid out in rows, carved with a tool, left with the dead for a reason that the living could no longer determine. Why was this mound so much larger than any other structure in its immediate landscape? Tomlinson had no answer. Nobody in Moundsville had an answer. But the stone itself seemed to demand one, and that demand would reverberate for the next 150 years. The stone left Tomlinson's hands quickly. It entered the wider world of 19th century scholarship, where it immediately produced not clarity but argument, and the nature of that argument revealed something troubling that had nothing to do with ancient history. It revealed how unreliable the process of examining the stone actually was. Multiple scholars produced transcriptions of the inscription. Careful men, working from the same object, applying the same professional standards of the era. Their transcriptions did not match. Not in minor details, in fundamental ways. The number of symbols recorded varied between accounts. The arrangement of the rows differed. Individual characters that one scholar rendered as clear and distinct, another rendered as ambiguous or absent entirely. Some went further, offering translations, into Canaanite, into early runic, into a half-dozen ancient scripts that had no documented presence anywhere near the Ohio Valley, each translation reflecting less what the stone actually said, and more what the translator hoped or feared it might mean. Letters flew between institutions. Published papers contradicted each other. The Smithsonian Institution received copies of the transcriptions and entered the argument, adding institutional weight to a debate that was generating more heat than light. The stone itself, the physical object that Tomlinson had pulled from the sealed vault, passed through multiple custodians, was reportedly lost at one point, and surfaced again in a condition that made direct comparison with the earliest descriptions difficult. Here is what that controversy actually demonstrated. Not that the inscription was fraudulent, not that it was genuine. What it demonstrated was that even trained observers, working from physical evidence they could hold and examine, could not agree on the most basic facts about what they were looking at. If that was true of one small stone in one opened vault, it raised an uncomfortable question about everything else the 19th century was claiming to know about the people who built these structures. Was Grave Creek an isolated case? One anomalous mound, one disputed stone, one family's local discovery, that had grown into a scholarly argument through a series of accidents. The answer to that question required looking beyond Western Virginia, and once investigators began looking beyond Western Virginia, the scope of what they were dealing with changed entirely. The mounds were not local. That was the fact that the broader survey of the American landscape kept returning to, and that 19th century scholarship kept struggling to absorb. From the Ohio Valley west into Illinois, from the Great Lakes south toward the Gulf Coast, the earthworks appeared with a consistency that defied easy explanation. Conical burial mounds, effigy mounds shaped into the outlines of animals and birds, and most striking of all, geometric enclosures of extraordinary scale and precision, earthen walls enclosing circles, squares, and octagons that stretched across miles of landscape. The Newark Earthworks in Ohio, the Hopewell sites of the Scioto Valley, the complexes of the Illinois River Basin. Each of these sites shared architectural features with the others, burial practices, construction techniques, artifact styles, despite being separated by distances that, in the pre-contact era, represented weeks or months of travel. The same approach to mound construction, the same geometric vocabulary in the enclosures, the same categories of grave goods appearing in burial chambers that were otherwise separated by hundreds of miles. What kind of shared knowledge produced that? What kind of communication, or common cultural inheritance, or sustained contact across vast distance could account for the consistency of a building tradition spread across a continent? The 19th century did not have a satisfying answer. What it had instead was a theory, and the theory was not built on evidence, it was built on assumption, on ideology, on a cultural need to believe something that the evidence, examined honestly, did not actually support. By the 1840s and 1850s, a narrative had taken hold in American popular culture, and, more troublingly, in serious publications that blurred the line between scholarship and imagination. The mounds, this narrative insisted, had not been built by the ancestors of the indigenous nations who occupied the surrounding land at the time of European contact. They had been built by someone else, a vanished race, a lost white civilization, predating indigenous settlement, whose descendants had died out or been displaced before history began recording events in North America. Vikings were proposed, ancient Israelites were proposed, a generalized lost race of superior builders was proposed again and again in books and magazines and lectures that reached a wide and receptive audience. The evidence for any of these theories was, in the strict sense, non-existent. No excavation had produced artifacts connecting the mounds to any of the proposed builders. No skeletal evidence supported the theory of a separate and distinct race of mound constructors. The burial goods found at sites like Grave Creek showed cultural continuity with the material culture of the indigenous nations in the same regions. Not discontinuity from it, but the theory was not popular because it was supported by evidence. It was popular because it served a function. A nation engaged in the active displacement of indigenous peoples from their land had a considerable cultural investment in believing those peoples had not built the most impressive structures on that land. If the mounds were built by a vanished race, they belonged to no one. If they were built by the ancestors of the nations being displaced, the moral implications were considerably more complicated. Washington eventually noticed, and when it did, it sent an institution. In 1881, the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology launched what would become the most comprehensive federal survey of North American mound sites ever conducted. The man placed in charge was Cyrus Thomas, a scholar of sufficient reputation to give the project credibility, and a man who arrived at his assignment with, by his own later account, an initial disposition toward the lost race theory. The Bureau's internal directives were explicit about the survey's purpose. It was not simply to document and measure. It was to address the mound builder question. The national controversy that the Grave Creek stone and its disputed inscription had helped ignite, and that 40 years of popular theorizing, had elevated into something that required an official resolution. That framing deserves attention. A scientific survey commissioned to settle. A predetermined question is a different instrument than a scientific survey commissioned to find out what the evidence shows. Cyrus Thomas and his field workers would spend more than a decade excavating hundreds of sites across the continent. The question is whether the investigation they conducted was designed to discover an answer or to produce one. What Thomas's surveyors found, when they took precise measurements, created something genuinely difficult to dismiss through theorizing of any kind. The geometric earthworks of the Ohio Valley were not approximately circular, approximately square, approximately octagonal. They were precisely these shapes, executed at a scale, and with a spatial accuracy that the survey's own instruments had to work carefully to confirm. The Great Circle at Newark enclosed an area of more than 4 acres with walls achieving a consistent height across the full perimeter. The Octagon earthwork adjacent to it enclosed 50 acres within walls whose angles, when surveyed with 19th century instruments, matched geometric regularity that would challenge a modern engineering crew working with modern equipment. How was this done? The standard attribution: a pre-agricultural society without metal tools, without the wheel, without draft animals, operating across a dispersed and mobile social structure, did not map comfortably onto the engineering capacity the measurements implied. Constructing a geometrically precise octagon enclosing 50 acres requires sustained observation, accurate measurement, and the organizational ability to coordinate labor across a project whose full form could not be perceived from ground level by anyone working on it. It requires knowledge of geometry as a practical discipline, not as an accident. And if this level of engineering coordination existed, if the people who built the Newark Octagon possessed the organizational sophistication to plan and execute that structure across what must have been generations of sustained effort, then what else about those same societies had been systematically underestimated? What capabilities, what knowledge systems, what social complexity had the convenient simplicity of the lost race theory helped erase from the conversation? The survey's measurements made the engineering undeniable. What they could not recover was everything that had already been lost before the surveyors arrived. By the time Thomas's teams began their systematic work in the 1880s, the destruction of the mound record was already well advanced. Agricultural expansion across the Ohio Valley, the Illinois Basin, and the broader Midwest had been leveling mounds for decades. Farmers plowed through them because the elevated earth was inconvenient for cultivation. Developers quarried them for fill material. Towns and later cities built directly over them without documentation. The mounds that the Bureau of Ethnology surveyed were the survivors, the sites that had escaped through luck or inaccessibility, or the particular attention of a local landowner, the agricultural and developmental pressures that had already erased an unknown but vast number of their counterparts. The survey's own field records suggest an awareness of this. Tally after tally noted sites where the mound had been recently removed, where the landowner reported that ploughing had been ongoing for 30 or 40 years, where the earthwork's former presence was visible only in the slight discoloration of the soil, or in the anomalous scatter of artifacts that appeared after each spring planting. The estimates produced by the survey of how many mound sites had existed before contact with European settlers, estimates necessarily built on inference from the damaged and incomplete landscape the surveyors actually traversed, ran into the hundreds of thousands. The surviving sites represented a fraction of that, a small, random, unrepresentative fraction, selected not by scholarly priority but by the accidents of 19th century land use. The inscription on Tomlinson's sandstone disc, disputed, retranscribed, argued over, and still unresolved, had been found in a vault that survived because a family happened not to plough over it before 1838. How many similar objects had already been turned under by the time the Bureau of Ethnology began its work? How many burial chambers had been emptied by farm work without a single notation? How many inscriptions, if there were others, had been destroyed before anyone with training saw them? The survey could not answer those questions. What it could answer, or claim to answer, was the central question it had been commissioned to address. The 1894 report produced by Cyrus Thomas, after 13 years of fieldwork, reached a definitive conclusion. The mounds had been built by the ancestors of indigenous peoples already present in North America at the time of European contact. The lost race theory was wrong. The evidence, Thomas argued, supported cultural continuity between the mound builders and the nations that European settlers had encountered. That conclusion has held as the institutional consensus ever since, and it may well be correct as far as it goes. But the survey's own internal records tell a more complicated story than the published report suggests. Field notes from individual surveyors contain descriptions of artifacts that do not appear in the final catalogue. Site records reference measurements and observations that the published summary does not incorporate. The tally of artifacts collected during the survey and the tally of artifacts verifiably accessioned into institutional collections do not fully reconcile. Some of this is the normal attrition of 19th century institutional record keeping. Paperwork lost, objects mislabeled, field notes not transferred to permanent record, but some of it is harder to explain as routine administrative failure. The Grave Creek tablet itself, the object that had opened the national controversy in 1838, that had travelled through institutions and private collections and scholarly arguments for decades before the survey began, appears in the Bureau's records in ways that do not fully track its physical history. The object, whose transcriptions had failed to agree across 40 years of examination, remained, in the survey's handling of it, an unresolved thread that the final report's definitive tone quietly papered over without resolving. If the official record itself is incomplete, if the survey that was meant to close the case contains internal contradictions between what was found and what was reported, then the question of whether the mound builder mystery was ever actually solved, or simply declared solved, is not a fringe position. It is a reasonable inference from the documents themselves, which brings this investigation to where it has always been heading. Not to an answer, because the evidence does not support the confidence that an answer would require, but to a reckoning. Abelard Tomlinson opened a shaft in November 1838 and found a sealed vault, a set of human remains, and a stone covered in symbols no one could read. That stone generated 40 years of public controversy, a federal survey that lasted 13 years, a report that declared the matter settled, and an institutional record that, examined closely, does not quite support the confidence of its own conclusions. The Newark Octagon still exists, its 50-acre geometry now overlaid by a golf course that complicates public access to one of the most significant prehistoric engineering achievements in North America. The Grave Creek Mound still stands in Moundsville, now a state park, its interior no longer open to private excavation. The Smithsonian's survey records are still accessible to researchers who know where to look. Field notes, catalogued discrepancies, artifact tallies that do not fully reconcile with published summaries, and beneath farmland across the Ohio Valley, beneath the subdivisions and highways and parking lots that cover what the survey's own estimates suggest, were hundreds of thousands of mound sites, lies everything that was never documented. The vaults that were ploughed flat in the 1850s before a single measurement was taken. The inscribed stones, if there were others like Tomlinson's, that were turned up by farm equipment and discarded or pocketed and lost. The burial chambers, whose contents scattered into agricultural soil without ever being recorded by anyone with the training or the institutional backing to preserve what they contained. The 1894 report concluded that the mounds were built by the ancestors of indigenous nations. That conclusion is almost certainly closer to the truth than the lost race theory it replaced. But it was built on a survey of a small, damaged, unrepresentative fraction of the sites that once existed. It was produced by an institution that entered the investigation with a mandate to settle a controversy, not simply to document what the evidence showed, and its internal records contain gaps and inconsistencies that the published report's confident tone does not acknowledge. The mound builder question was declared answered in 1894. Whether it was actually answered is a different question entirely. What lies under the ground that was never surveyed? The hundreds of thousands of sites estimated to have existed, the overwhelming majority of which were destroyed before anyone with a notebook arrived, remains permanently beyond reach. The evidence that would have allowed a truly complete answer was not suppressed in a single dramatic moment. It was lost incrementally, ploughed under season by season, quarried away load by load, built over without notation across the entire span of 19th century American expansion. That loss is the final thing this investigation leaves with, not a conspiracy, not a cover-up in the conventional sense, something quieter and in some ways more troubling, the possibility that the most important question in North American prehistory was declared, settled, at precisely the moment when so much of the evidence needed to answer it had already been permanently destroyed. The shaft Tomlinson dug is long since filled. The stone is in a case somewhere. The mounds that survived are still in the ground, and what was in the ones that didn't survive is a question that no institution, no survey, and no report has ever been in a position to answer.